Okay, let's do this. Part 2. This cemetery of small gods was for the people who didn't know what happened next. They didn't know what they believed in, or if there was a life after death, and often they didn't know what hit them. They'd gone through life being amiably uncertain until the ultimate certainty had claimed them at last. Among the city's bone orchards, the cemetery was the equivalent of the drawer marked Misk, where people were interred in the glorious expectation of nothing very much. Most of the watch got buried there. Policemen, after a few years, found it hard to believe in people, let alone anyone they couldn't see. For once, it wasn't raining. The breeze shook the sooty poplars around the wall, making them rustle. "We ought to have brought some flowers," said Colin, as they made their way through the long grass. "I could nick a few off some of the fresh graves, Sarge," Nobby volunteered. "Not the kind of thing I want to hear you saying at this time, Nobby," said Colin severely. "Sorry, Sarge. At a time like this, a man ought to be thinking about his immortal soul vis-a-vis the endless mighty river that is history. I should do that if I was you, Nobby." Up against one wall, lilac trees were growing. That is, at some point in the past, a lilac had been planted there, and had given rise, as lilac will, to hundreds of whippy suckers, so that what had once been one stem was now a thicket. Every branch was covered in pale mauve blooms. The graves were still just visible in the tangled vegetation. In front of them stood cut-me-own-throat Dibbler, Ankh-Morpork's least successful businessman, with a sprig of lilac in his hat. He caught sight of the watchmen and nodded to them. They nodded back. All three stood looking down at the 7 graves. Only one had been maintained. The marble headstone on that one was shiny and moss-free. The turf was clipped, the stone border was sparkling. Moss had grown over the wooden markers of the other 6, but it had been scraped off the central one, revealing the name John Keel. And carved underneath, by someone who had taken some pains, was, "How do they rise up?" A huge wreath of lilac flowers, bound with purple ribbon, had been placed on the grave. On top of it, tied around with another piece of purple ribbon, was an egg. "Mrs. Palm and Mrs. Batty and some of the girls were up here earlier," said Dibbler, "and of course Madam always makes sure there's the egg." "It's nice the way they always remember," said Sergeant Colin. The 3 stood in silence. They were not, on the whole, men with a vocabulary designed for times like this. After a while, though, Nobby felt moved to speak. "He gave me a spoon once," he said to the air in general. "Yeah, I know," said Colin. "My dad pinched it off me when he came out of prison, but it was my spoon," said Nobby persistently. "That means a lot to a kid, your own spoon." "Come to that, he was the first person to make me a sergeant," said Colin. "Got busted down again, of course, but I knew I could do it again then. He was a good copper." "He bought a pie off of me first week I was starting out," said Dibbler. "Ate it all. Didn't spit out anything." There was more silence. After a while Sergeant Colin cleared his throat, a general signal to indicate that some sort of appropriate moment was now over. There was a relaxation of muscles all around. "You know, we ought to come up here one day with a billhook and clear this lot up a bit," said the sergeant. "You always say that, Sarge, every year," said Nobby as they walked away, "and we never do." "If I had $1 for every copper's funeral I've attended up here," said Colin, "I'd have $19.50. "50 pence?" said Nobby. "That was when Corporal Hildebiddle woke up just in time and banged on the lid," said Colin. "And that was before your time, of course. Everyone said it was an amazing recovery." "Mr. Sergeant!" The 3 men turned. Coming towards them, in a high-speed sidle, was the black-clad, skinny figure of Legitimate First, the cemetery's resident grave digger. Colin sighed. "Yes, Leggy," he said. "Good morrow, sweet. the gravedigger began, but Sergeant Colin waved a finger at him. "Stop that right now," he said. "You know you've been warned before. None of that comic gravedigger stuff. It's not funny and it's not clever. Just say what you got to say. No silly bits." Ledgie looked crestfallen. "Well, good sirs." "Ledgie, I've known you for years," said Colin wearily. "Just try, will ya?" "The deacon wants them graves dug up, Fred," said Ledgie in a sulky voice. "It's been more'n 30 years. Long past time they was in the crypts." "No," said Fred Colin. "But I've got a nice shelf for 'em down there, Fred," Ledgie pleaded. "Right up near the front. We need the space, Fred. It's standing room only in here, and that's the truth. Even the worms have got to go in single file. Right up near the front, Fred, where I can chat to 'em when I'm having my tea. How about that?" The watchman and Dibbler shared a glance. Most people in the city had been into Ledgie's crypts, if only for a dare, and it had come as a shock to most of them to realise that solemn burial was not for eternity, but only for a handful of years, so that, in Ledgie's words, "my wriggly little helpers" could do their work. After that, the last resting place was the crypts, and an entry in the huge ledgers. Ledgie lived down in the crypts. As he said, he was the only one who did, and he liked the company. Ledgie was generally considered weird, but conscientiously so. "This isn't your idea, right?" said Fred Colin. Ledgie looked down at his feet. "Ah, the new deacon's a bit, well, new," he said. "You know, keen, making changes." "You told him why they're not being dug up," said Nobby. "He said that's just ancient history," said Ledgie. "He says we all have to put the past behind us." "And did you tell him he should take it up with veterinary?" said Nobby. "Yes, and he said he was sure his lordship was a forward-thinking man who wouldn't cling to relics of the past," said Ledgie. "Sounds like he is new," said Dibbler. "Yeah," said Nobby, "and not likely to get old. It's okay, Ledgie, you can say you've asked us." The gravedigger looked relieved. "Thanks, Nobby," he said, "and I'd just like to say that when your time comes, gents, you'll be on a good shelf with a view. I've put your names down on my ledger for them as comes after me." "Well, that's, very kind of you, Ledgie," said Colin, wondering if it was. Because of pressure of space, bones in the crypts were stored by size, not by owner. There were rooms of ribs, there were avenues of femurs, there was shelf after shelf of skulls up near the entrance, of course, because a crypt without a lot of skulls wasn't a proper crypt at all.